Bring in the front bench panel of former premiers to unpack how those two things can coexist. Joining us this evening, former Alberta Premier Alison Redford. She's now the principal at the Redford Group. Former Manitoba Premier Gary Dewar. He's now a director of the Climate Group and a senior business advisor at Dentons. And former Nova Scotia Premier Daryl Dexter. He's now vice chair of Global Public Affairs. Hi, everybody. Really nice to see you tonight. I appreciate you making the time. Gary, I'll start with you. As I read out one of your titles there as the director of Climate Group, I thought it was an interesting day, just given all these advisories, to talk about the debate around climate change and really how much we do and what we do to address it. Do you think that Mr. Poilievre's message is resonating given the current cost of living crisis a lot of people are facing?
Well, I think the message on climate is being delivered every hour in our neighborhood of North America. And certainly I was on a climate board call this morning. And, I remember a couple of years ago, there was a wonderful report out of the Pew Research Group in the United States when I was ambassador that called the boreal forest in Canada the lungs of North America. And certainly that is not the situation today. But it's not just the wildfires, which are, as you stated, are crossing borders and moving south as we speak. It's also the extreme heat in Texas. That's a situation with hurricanes in Florida and other places. And so there's a lot of weather-related experiences people are having that are raising the awareness of dealing with climate. It won't solve climate change policy, long-term policy, won't solve the immediate issue of forest fires. We have agreements with the United States. Actually, the agreement was signed a number of years ago in Boise, Idaho, with the Forestry Department and the Secretary of Interior, where we exchange people and airplanes and equipment and fire attack crews to try to get in as fast as possible. And what looks like what's happening now is we're not getting into there as quickly as we should to knock those fires down as importantly as that would be. And we're going to have to up our game, I think, across Canada and in the United States. But the climate change debate will be definitely developed by the weather-related incidents that are taking place right across North America.
I think, to be blunt, Alison, the acute nature of what's happening right now with the smoke and the fires certainly creates a vulnerability for the Conservatives insofar as they have not yet detailed their climate plan. But I do also think at the same time there is a vulnerability for the Liberals on the carbon tax right now, and that's evidenced by the fact that so many Atlantic premiers, for example, are joining forces, even a Liberal in Newfoundland and Labrador, to say, hey, this is getting really expensive. And those clean fuel regulations, which I understand the impetus for, premiers in the West are writing a letter saying, we really don't want you to do this. So the opposition is not just solely from kind of the federal level at of the Conservatives, and I think in the immediacy, at least, is a bit of a vulnerability for them. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's true. And, as the ambassador said, this is a complicated issue, and that's never what politicians like to say when they have to answer a question. However, I do think that coming up with only the carbon tax solution may not be enough. And as Gary said, and as the ambassador said, we are beginning to look to other forms of cooperation to deal with some of these climate issues. As soon as these fires started, you could hear people talking about how this clearly had something to do with climate change. People understand that this is all connected. But I think that we have to make sure that the carbon tax is not the square peg in the round hole. If you have a hammer, then the solution to everything is a nail. 10 years ago, carbon tax was innovative. It was something that people didn't want to accept. They didn't want to understand. Many of us as premiers brought it in anyway, but now it's about an awful lot more than that. And I think that if we can now move ahead on that in terms of the policy discussion and really try to connect it to what's really going on the ground in terms of how it's affecting people's lives, then I think we have an opportunity. I want to jump in and just make one other point, which is quite troubling, especially for us from more rural areas or places with more land, is that we've seen a real decline in terms of volunteer firefighters in the past 5 or 6 years. to the point of, I think, almost 30%. And so there's even work to be done, as Gary said, about how we prevent and how we get in there quickly to deal with these fires before they start. You know, fire response should be a line item in provincial budgets, and in some cases it's not. But I do think that while there can be a discussion about whether or not carbon tax is an added cost to people who right now are having difficulty meeting their monthly budgets, that we have to ask people who are dealing with these policies to not just say yes or no to carbon tax, but think about the other solutions that we really do need to start to talk about, and that we frankly should have been ahead of 5 or 6 years ago, which continues to be our challenge, I think, on climate.
The U.S. could, in some ways, provide some sort of a baseline for that, Daryl, insofar as, you know, the IRA, and you can debate the merits of all that. The IRA and the policies pursued by the White House don't include anything on the consumer end. And if the Conservatives are to come forward with a policy, that could be a starting point for them. I still maintain that they will have to because people are talking about it, to both Gary and Alison's point, all the time right now, given what we're looking at right outside my window as I speak.
Well, first of all, I think the original question was around the vulnerability of the Liberals on a carbon tax, and let me tell you, I think it's a matter of great vulnerability in Atlantic Canada. The reality of the carbon tax, and nobody's debating whether or not it's effective. The carbon tax will have an effect in terms of consumption. The problem with it is it's a clumsy tool from a public policy perspective, because it treats unequally situated people equally. And that means that people who live in rural communities, people who are unable to, for example, pay what is required to do the kinds of upgrades in their homes to become more energy efficient, all those people tend to be poor, senior citizens, all of those people are affected far differently than if you live in an urban center where you have access to public transportation, where you're likely in a better income situation. So it's a very clumsy public policy tool to try and deal with an issue where you need to be doing what is essentially direct action. And certainly in our province, one of the first things that we wanted to do was to just simply move the utility off of fossil fuel. So that's was a rapid escalation in bringing in a proper fuel mix, which included renewables. To do that quickly, and the result was that we were able to negotiate an equivalency agreement with the federal government in order to avoid the worst provisions of that time of the Environment Act, which was going to significantly impact the cost to consumers in Nova Scotia. So the question is, why isn't that, and I think this was your point with respect to the IRA, why aren't we seeing, and why isn't it being demonstrated, the kind of federal government's impact and kind of directly funding, whether it's programs or whether it is new initiatives that directly affect the greenhouse gas emissions through the use of fossil fuels. Like, that direct action is a much better public policy than simply taxation.
Vassy,
Okay, I have to take a commercial. Yeah, Gary, quick point to you, and then I got to take a commercial. Go right ahead.
Quick point. Canada, there's a lot of jargon and a lot of politics in this debate. Canada has won the lottery in terms of what we have going for us. And I believe that people will believe it's possible to do something on climate change if we had simple solutions. For example, we could be coal-free in our electrical grid in Canada in the next 3 years. BC is coal-free, Alberta's going coal-free, Manitoba's coal-free, you've got Saskatchewan with micro nuclear, you've got Ontario coal-free, you've got Quebec coal-free, we have the grids to build into Atlantic Canada, they're building more renewables, and so something that is understandable. People know that coal is dirty. We can have an electrical grid in this country that we could actually say is a model to the United States. we're getting it done. But right now it's jargon and politics. It doesn't seem to be resonating with the public. The public needs hope that we can get stuff done, and I think we can.
Okay, on that note, a positive one. I'm going to take a